Welcome to the Trellix Spotlight series. My name is Nick, and I will be your host. Today's session will focus on ePolicy Orchestrator On-prem cumulative updates and disaster recovery. This webinar will be recorded. If you prefer not to participate in the recorded session, please feel free to disconnect at this time. A link to today's recorded presentation will be emailed to all registered attendees. This webinar is a brief overview covering common use cases and scenarios regarding this topic. It is not intended to be all-encompassing. If assistance is needed, please contact Trellix Technical Support. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them in the Q&A window. This webinar may run longer or shorter based on your participation, and we recommend asking as many questions as you can to make the most of this series. If the Q&A window is not displayed, click the tab at the bottom of your session window and click on the Q&A icon. We will answer the questions during the final section of this webinar. If you experience any audio issues during the webcast, please drop and attempt to reconnect. Our speaker today is Chris Gelsky. Chris is a staff customer success engineer at Trellix. Chris has over 18 years with Trellix supporting ePolicy Orchestrator, the Trellix Agent, and EPO SaaS. Ladies and gentlemen, Chris.
Thank you, Nick. Okay, today we are going to talk about two things, the cumulative updates and disaster recovery. So for both, we'll look at some of the common issues that we see with these two things. For cumulative updates, we'll talk about what you can upgrade from and to, and then we'll talk about recovering from a failed update when something goes wrong with that, and then we'll look at a demo of the disaster recovery process. So to start, we're going to go into the cumulative updates. Cumulative updates came around starting with EPO 5.10. Before 5.10, so 5.1, 5.3, 5.9, they all used patching via full installer. We didn't have the cumulative update patches or whatever that we have now. So if you've been using EPO for a while, you may be already familiar with that. So a cumulative update is going to be kind of a quicker way to install any kind of bug fixes or minor feature changes. And to start, I want to talk about the difference between Service Pack 1 and Service Pack 1 update. So by now, most of you, if not all of you, have encountered a cumulative update or have installed the cumulative update on EPO 5.10. But Service Pack 1 is our first full release since the release of 5.10 a couple years ago. So Service Pack 1 is a fully branded installation package. So it's kind of a line in the sand. So we removed all of the McAfee branded software, so that is no longer available on our product downloads page. So the Service Pack 1 is what you'll find out there today if you go download an EPO installer. But what's the difference between Service Pack 1 and Service Pack 1 update? The wording on this can get a little bit confusing, so I just kind of wanted to explain this out a little bit. So EPO 5.10 Service Pack 1, the one without the update at the end. So Service Pack 1, it's a full installer. So if you're installing EPO for the first time, this is what you would use. If you're upgrading from an earlier version, so 5.3 or 5.9, you would use the EPO Service Pack 1 installer. So Service Pack 1 includes all the previous cumulative updates that were released for the original release of 5.10. So that would be cumulative update 1 through 15. Service Pack 1 update. Basically, you can look at this as update 16 or CU 16 in a way. So you can use this to update EPO 5.10 if it's already installed and you're already running EPO 5.10 or CU 1 through 15. So if you're running any of those versions, you would want to use the Service Pack 1 updates package to get to Service Pack 1 version. You don't need to run that if you're already on Service Pack 1. So if you already ran the full installer to upgrade from EPO 5.9, you don't need the cumulative update version of Service Pack 1. So the upgrade path, what can you upgrade from and to? So this can get a little bit confusing. So we have a KB that we've released, KB 96141. This contains a matrix on it that kind of shows you everything that you can upgrade to, depending on what you're running. And so the screenshot here on the slide just kind of shows you a sample of that. And the way that you would use this is you would find the current version of EPO that you're running now on the left-hand column. So you go down and say you're running EPO 5.10 CU 15. If you notice, you can't actually go to EPO 5.10 Service Pack 1 update, and you can't go to 5.10 Service Pack 1. Sorry, I should say you can't go to Service Pack 1 Update 1, which is available now, but you can use the EPO 5.10 Service Pack 1 update. It's a little bit confusing, so hopefully the matrix will help you out. So a couple of examples here. You can go from CU15 to Service Pack 1 update, as I just mentioned. You can go from Service Pack 1 to Service Pack 1 Update 1, but you can't upgrade from CU15 to the Service Pack 1 Update 1, and you can't upgrade from, say, 5.10 CU9 to 5.10 Service Pack 1, the full installer. You can't use the full installer for that. So again, it is a little confusing. Hopefully the KB here that I've referenced here, the 96141, will kind of help you out if you're trying to determine which patch or which installer you can use to update your EPO version. Okay, cumulative update, common issues. So there are a few issues that we kind of see on a more frequent basis. So I wanted to mention those here. So first of all, what are the symptoms that you see when you try to run an update and it doesn't work? So the most simple version of a failure is a straight failure message, right? So you try to run the updater and it basically comes up and tells you that it failed to install. And so when that happens, it should roll back and should be left to the state you were in prior to attempting the update in the first place. But in some cases, you might see that the installation completes, but something doesn't work with EPO after it completes. So that might be something that you see. It's maybe more of a rare case to see that, but it does happen. And then in some cases, when the update does fail and it says, okay, we're rolling back, it tries to roll back and it doesn't actually do that successfully. There's been a few cases of that. And some of the symptoms or I would say the most common symptoms of that is after the rollback happens, then you can't start the services for EPO, or one or more of the services won't start, or you might even find that one or more of the services are missing. So that could be some of the typical symptoms you see if the update doesn't work as expected. In most cases, we found that you run the update, it runs through within a minute, and then it's done. It's completely successful, and everything works. You can log back into EPO. But if it does encounter some sort of failure, if you want to actually kind of dig into this a little bit and see if you can understand why it failed yourself, there's definitely a log that you can look at. We always store that log under the user temp directory, and you'll find a folder there named Trellix logs. And the file name is going to be EPO updater dot the date that you ran the install.log. And if you want a tip on how to find that failure in there, what you do is just kind of search for your first instance of the word failure, space colon, space 1. You can see an example in the slide, in the screenshot on the slide here. The failure message is just above that point in the log where it says failure space colon space 1. In this case, I've pointed out kind of a common thing that we've seen recently because one of the common symptoms that we've seen is the upgrade or the update can't succeed because there's one of the files it's trying to update is already in use by something else on the system. So this has been quite frequent compared to other issues. It's probably one of the most common things that we'll see. More specifically, the file that's listed in this log here is at the very top of that screenshot. There's the naprf.ctr.dll. Now this is our performance counter DLL. So this is not updated in most CUs. But when you install Service Pack 1, it does update that DLL, or it tries to. And so a lot of customers are using the Windows performance counters. The Windows performance counter services are running. And so the Windows performance counter services are running, they could be locking that file. If those services are locking that file, we won't be able to update. The updater will fail and then we'll roll back. So that specific issue is referenced in the KB that I pointed out in the slide here, the KB 96547. If you want to find out more information about, there's a lot of details in there, but essentially most of the time that happens, the update rolls back, you're back to the way you started, you go stop the services for the performance counter, and then the update will succeed. Okay, a couple more things that we've seen kind of on a frequent basis, SQL timeout issues. So you try to run the updater is actually going to, in a lot of cases, run some SQL scripts against the database and make some modifications there. And if we try to run a SQL script and the connection gets closed on us by SQL, then that will fail. That will cause the entire update to fail. So there's a setting inside SQL. So this is a per database setting that you can enable called auto close. More details are in KB 91469 about that setting. But if auto close is enabled, it could potentially close a connection on us when we're trying to run one of those SQL scripts. So make sure that auto close is disabled on both the primary EPO database and the events database. And that's kind of a thing that should always be set to false, right? Or disabled. We don't want auto close on. That will cause other issues outside of the update failure. And then finally, probably another common issue that we see is permissions issue. When you're using EPO, you have an account for SQL, an account inside EPO in the core config page that's actually used to connect to SQL. So normal everyday navigation of EPO doesn't require as high level permissions as an update or an upgrade might require. So KB 75766, which has been out there for quite some time, will actually kind of outline the permissions that SQL account needs. And then again, there's different permissions that are needed for normal use, everyday use of EPO, and permissions that are needed for an actual upgrade or cumulative update install. So check that KB, make sure that account listed in core config meets those requirements before you run the update. Because I just want to kind of point out some of the things that I mentioned before. So stop services before running the update. You'll see the 4 services in blue here. Those are our services, the services that are installed when you install EPO. Then the performance monitor services under that: WMI performance adapter, performance counter, DLL host, and performance logs and alerts. All 3 of those services could potentially be started. Stop them all before running an update, and then also stop our own services before running an update. Now, when you run the cumulative update, it's going to try to stop those services for you, and a lot of times that will work fine. But one of the problematic services there is the application service, otherwise known as the Tomcat service. So that service, a lot of times it's doing some pretty lengthy work. In the background, you might have a long-running server task, something like that service is actually handling or executing. So if you try to stop that service, sometimes you'll see it takes quite a bit of time to stop that. And that's not abnormal. I mean, depending on what Tomcat's doing, that might be normal to see that taking a long time. So that's why we say go ahead and stop services before running the update instead of having the update try to do that. If you stop those services, you could notice it takes several minutes for it to stop. That's fine. Just wait until they're all stopped. Go ahead and stop those other 3 perfmon services, and then go ahead and run your update. But a couple other things you do want to make sure of before you run the update actually is that you have your backups taken prior to. In worst case scenario, when you try to make any change to EPO, worst case scenario, the EPO is now unusable after that. And that could happen for any number of reasons. And so not just the update, but always before you make any big change to EPO or a database change, make sure you have backups beforehand. And that is going to include mostly a disaster recovery snapshot and database backup, or even a manual backup of your EPO install files. So we'll talk about this in the next section, but KB 66616 outlines the files that you need to have when you're backing up or restoring for a manual disaster recovery. So outside of your DR snapshot and database backup, it's also good to have a backup of those files as well, just in case. Okay, so what happens when the update goes wrong? Well, there's a couple of things that you can do that are pretty quick and easy. So first of all, inside the cumulative updater, we have these features to either rollback or repair. So to get to these, all you have to do is run the same update that you just ran that failed. So in the previous cases, when I stated if the update actually succeeded and then something doesn't work after that, or the update failed, and then when it tried to roll back, something doesn't work after that, that's the 2 scenarios in which you might need to use the rollback or repair feature. So these are both going to be fairly successful. So I would say that when you run into an issue, the first thing that I would try to do is run a repair. So if you've run the installer for the cumulative update and that completed, and then that didn't work, or there's something that's not working afterwards, run the installer again, and then you'll see this repair option, this repair button. And what that's going to do is it's going to try to just copy all of the files over again and run all of our SQL scripts again, right? So it's essentially going to go through the same update process. So if you run the repair, if something doesn't work, maybe you can just restart the server, run your repair, and then see if running the update again in repair mode actually fixes it. And a lot of times it does, and then it's very, very quick and easy if that's something that helps you. If that doesn't work, you can always try to use the rollback feature. So if the rollback feature is there, so if you run this and it doesn't detect that the update's actually there, you won't see this, or that option won't be available to you. But if you can always roll back the update to see if that fixes the problem. The rollback is basically going to take all of the files that were backed up before the update ran in the first place, and then put them back into place. And there's also some SQL revert scripts that will run that will revert the changes in SQL that were made by that cumulative updater. So again, another option that often quickly fixes a problem if you encounter a problem after running the update. So I mentioned earlier, some of the times when you run the cumulative updater and that fails, and then it tries to roll back, you might see in certain situations that the services for EPO are either missing, or they don't start. You might even see that the names have changed depending on what version you're upgrading from. So we have a batch file that we've created here in support that does a service repair, and that's available in this KB that I've got listed on the slide, 94506. And this is a very simple file, and what it does is it actually queries the existing installation files to determine first what version of the EPO files are actually on the hard drive. Based on that, it's going to run a service install of all 3 services of the correct version that are supposed to be on there according to the version that you're running. Oftentimes, this actually fixes a problem where the services are missing or don't start very quickly and easily if you encounter a situation after a failed rollback. So keep that KB in mind. And lastly, if all else fails and we can't get the EPO server back up and running, it might be necessary to perform some sort of disaster recovery, and that's the section that we'll talk about next. So disaster recovery, again, most if not all of you have probably already kind of looked at or gone through this process, or one or both of these processes. There are 2 different ways from the Trellix perspective to recover the EPO server. On that is a manual disaster recovery, the process listed in KB 66616, and then we have the disaster recovery snapshot feature. So the manual disaster recovery is a lengthy process, and there's a lot of points of failure there you could encounter. But the short summary is you take a set of files that were previously backed up, install a fresh version of EPO, and then stop all the services for that. Take those backed up files and then overwrite the new files that were just laid down by the fresh install. Then you're going to restore the database that was backed up prior, and then you're going to run a command to regenerate the SSL cert files. And once you've done that, if everything goes smoothly, then you will start the services back up for EPO and hopefully be able to get in the console and everything's back the way it was. However, like I said, that is a pretty lengthy process. There's a total of 16 steps involved in that. There's a lot of steps in there that are easy to mess up. Files don't get put back in the right place. Not all files, get back to where they were supposed to. One of the commands doesn't work correctly to regenerate the cert files. So there's a lot of points of failure in there that could cause the whole thing to just not work in the end, and you're left with having to restart the process over. So manual disaster recovery can definitely be a pain. So I would definitely recommend, if you can, use the disaster recovery snapshot feature. So if you're not familiar with the disaster recovery snapshot, the short summary of that is you have a server task that runs in EPO that takes a snapshot of your EPO installation. In other words, it takes the files that are on your EPO installation folder and then backs those up into the database. From there, you would back up the database in SQL. And if a disaster strikes, then what you're going to do from there is run your install of EPO onto the server you're wanting to restore to. Choose the option to restore from a snapshot, point it to the SQL server that's got your existing database backup, and then it's going to do all those steps for you and automatically restore EPO back to the way it was before. So that's the short version of what disaster recovery does. But the KB that I've listed here, 87976, is actually a very good KB to reference if you haven't seen that before. And not only goes through the whole process, it talks about the whole process in general, but it also gives you some best practices to follow, either before you get to the point of disaster or after. So some of the issues that we see with a disaster recovery. Probably one of the most common issues is that the DR passphrase is incorrect. When you install EPO for the first time, it's going to ask you to enter a password for your admin account, and it's also going to ask you to enter the password for the DR passphrase. The DR passphrase is used to encrypt any of the data that's being backed up during the snapshot task, and it's also going to be used it's also the password that's going to be used to decrypt that data when you're doing a snapshot recovery. So that's very important. A lot of times customers will set that on the initial install. Months or years will go by before they have to use the disaster recovery snapshot, if ever, and then they don't remember the password or have lost it. So make sure you know that. You can actually go through server settings, disaster recovery, and re-enter that password if you don't know that you are 100% sure of what that password is right now. So remember that. If you try to do a snapshot restore and you don't remember the password and you can't think of it, you can't find it, there's not a way around that. All right. So the only step from there is to go through a manual disaster recovery if you have the files backed up. So it's a pretty important piece to remember. The next thing, database and backup files don't match, right? So again, when you take a snapshot of the EPO install, it's backing up the files that are on the hard drive into the database. So this is going to be more important or most important when we're talking about extensions, because when you install an extension to EPO, part of that extension install goes to the hard drive, and then part of that goes to the database. So if you take a snapshot, it's going to back up the part of that goes to the hard drive into the database, and that should match the versioning and the bits and pieces of that extension that are in the database. So if you take a snapshot and then don't back up your database, but then you make some kind of change to an extension, you remove an extension or install a new extension or upgrade an extension. Now the files that are in the bits and pieces of that extension in the database are going to be updated, but the ones in the snapshot are not. So I would always say that as a best practice, and that's mentioned in the previous KB about the overview of disaster recovery snapshot, when you take a disaster recovery snapshot, always back up the database very soon after. So you probably want to kind of align those two tasks together. Your server snapshot task is running at one point, and then soon after your database backup occurs. More information about that is in the KB mentioned here, 92093. Third thing, admin credentials are incorrect. So whatever admin account they use to perform the disaster recovery, if the password for that doesn't match, then the install is going to fail. And the KB that I've got mentioned there kind of mentions the error messages that you might see during that process. So disaster recovery, let's see, restoring to a different path with a different name. If you restore to another server that has a new name, that's generally fine. When you run the disaster recovery, the process is going to ask you what path you want to install to. That's also generally fine if you want to install to a different path, I would say. However, we found an issue that if you're doing both of those things at the same time, so if you're restoring to a server with a different name and you are restoring to a different path during a recovery, it could cause the recovery to fail. More details that are listed in the KB that I've got on the slide here, 95366. We're currently investigating that issue to update a future release so that doesn't happen. But as it stands right now, if you are restoring to a server with a different name and you need to restore to a different path, you may need to use the manual disaster recovery process. So if possible, if you're using a different server name, then change or keep the same path. Most of the time that's feasible, and the disaster recovery snapshot recovery feature, I should say, will succeed fine. Next thing is TLS settings are incorrect, and most of the time this is going to happen if something's changing with the SQL server. If you do a restore and you're pointing to a new SQL server, perhaps the new SQL server doesn't have the same TLS settings as the old SQL server. So the KB91304 kind of outlines that issue and tells you what SQL ciphers and protocols should be enabled on the SQL server and how to do that. So keep that KB in mind. If you don't have the correct settings, then disaster recovery will fail, or even just a normal manual disaster recovery will fail as well. Then there's a couple of times we've seen where there's issues encountered where the customers got SQL and EPO on the same machine. So if you have those two on the same machine, there's actually one or two different issues you might run into depending on what version you're using. If you're using EPO prior to EPO 5.10 prior to Service Pack 1, then you actually during the install would have to have TLS 1.0 enabled during the installation. And that's something that has been fixed in SP1, but there's actually a different issue that you might encounter if you're using EPO 5.10 SP1 and SQL and EPO are on the same server. In that situation, SP1 doesn't install the SQL native client. So when you install when you install EPO, we do one of the checks or one of the component checks during the install uses the SQL native client to connect to SQL. And since Service Pack 1 doesn't first lay down that native client during the installation, if you don't have that already on the SQL server, on the EPO server, then you could encounter a problem with that. That's a pretty easy fix. We do actually have the setup files for the SQL native client included with the EPO install. As you just run a quick setup that lays down within a minute or two, and then you run the install of EPO again, that should succeed. So lastly, the any kind of corrupt files with the backed up files that you've taken from manual disaster recovery, or if there's some corruption in the snapshot. This is probably one of the most least common things to see, but I mean, there are any number of things that could cause the files to become either corrupt or some files missing within the set of backup files that you have or in the snapshot table. So if you encounter that situation, unfortunately, there's not an easy way around that. If something has already happened, your EPO server is gone. Otherwise, if the original EPO server is up and running and you can actually take the snapshot again or back up again, then that would be the solution for that. But again, that's probably a less common thing to see. Okay, so now I just want to go through a quick demo just to kind of show you the process for disaster recovery. So to start out with, I'm going to go into my existing EPO server. I've got a couple of different EPO servers set up to demonstrate this. So I'm going to log into my first EPO server and kind of show you some of the things that you would see in there before the disaster happens or before you have to use this process. I mentioned before that within EPO, there's a daily task that runs that takes the snapshot. And if you open the EPO console, go to the dashboard screen, one of the dashboards that you'll see is either named Trellix EPO Server Snapshot or EPO Server Snapshot, depending on what version of EPO that you're using. And when you open that, you should see one of three states. Either the snapshot is green, it means it's good, it's saved to the database. It'll tell you that the last time it backed up there. You will have might have a message here that says the snapshot is out of date. It can become out of date for a couple of different reasons. Or you may not see, or you may see that there's no snapshot period. The snapshot task has never run. So most of the time, one of those three states will be there. Either that, or you'll see a blue bar if it's actually currently saving the snapshot. Going back to one of the things that could make your database snapshot out of date, there's three main things that will cause that to become out of date. So the first thing I want kind of demonstrate for you is under server settings, you'll find the disaster recovery menu on the left. And this is what I talked about before. If you don't know your password, then you can come in here and reset the password. As a matter of fact, I would recommend that if you're not 100% sure, you go ahead and do that. And then definitely take note of what that password is. I'm going to go ahead and change this to demonstrate the snapshot becoming out of date. So I've just entered my password and re-entered that. I'm just going to save it. Now I have a new passphrase saved. And if I go back to my snapshot dashboard, I can see that now my snapshot is out of date because the snapshot that I already had in my database was encrypted using that old password. So if you do change the passphrase for disaster recovery, you do have to come back and take that snapshot again. So you can use this take snapshot button, or you can just go to menu server task and you'll see a disaster recovery server task there, and you can just run that. And again, that does run every night by default, except for in cases if you happen to be using SQL Express with your EPO server, because SQL Express has a hard limit on the database size of 10 gigabytes. If EPO is installed and during the time of installation, it detects SQL Express is in use, it will disable that disaster recovery snapshot task that runs every night. The reason being is that it's possible that the snapshot itself could take up several gigs of space in your database table. And if that happens, then that could quickly put you to or over the size limit that's enforced by SQL Express. So we disable that task if you're using SQL Express. You can still run it manually if you want, but you have to kind of keep an eye on your database size there to make sure you don't go over. If you go over that 10 gig limit in size that's enforced on the SQL side, then EPO will stop working. So then the next step after we've got our snapshot saved is to go into SQL and make sure that we have a backup of our database. You may have a couple of different ways that you do this. You may have some regular every 15-minute backups that are running, but just to quickly demonstrate how you might manually do this, if you go into the management studio on your SQL server and then find your EPO database, here on the left, mine is named EPO_EPO serve 1. So if I right click on that, go to tasks, I'll have an option here for backup. And the options here are full or differential. And in my case, I want to do a full backup. And then I can specify any location that I want to store that backup. The default location that I have here is fine. So I'm just going to go ahead and click OK on that. I have a very, very small lab database. Nothing's really in here, so it's very quick. Likely will not run that quick on yours. And in any case, with EPO 5.10, there are two databases if you are not already aware. And when you back up the database for EPO, you want to make sure that you back up both of those. So I'm just going to go ahead and go in here and back up this one as well. Again, the default settings are set the way I want them. I'm going to click OK. That's very, very quick because I don't really have any events in this database. So that completes the backup portion of the disaster recovery process. Now I'm ready for any disaster to occur, so I'll go back and essentially create my own little disaster by stopping the EPO services. So with EPO, I'll have 3 services that I'll need to stop. The Tomcat service, which will also tell me I need to stop my service, and then of course my event parser service. Now I'm going to go over to my second EPO server to demonstrate the restore process instead of just uninstalling on the first one. So I'll open my installation files for EPO 5.10 Service Pack 1. And if you don't already know, at one point we did repost the Service Pack 1 installer package because there was an issue with an RBSafe library that did not work with some CPUs. So we fixed that and reposted the full install package, and that is now the build 4098, and the package name will be named this LR1. You'll see at the end 4098 LR1. If you don't already have that one, don't run the install. Make sure you download the latest version of the EPO 5.10 Service Pack 1 full installer. So to start, I'll just run the setup file for that. And one of the first screens that comes up on the installation, whether or not I'm doing disaster recovery, is this option or this question do I want to restore from an existing snapshot? So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and check that box because I am restoring from an existing snapshot. Once I do that, I'll click next. It's going to ask me, do I want to change the installation path? I'm just going to leave it as is. And as I mentioned earlier, you generally can change the installation path. It's fine, except for if you are restoring to a server with a different name. I would say don't change this if you don't have to. You may have to use the manual process. But I've left it the same because I do have a server with a different name. I'm just going to search for SQL servers, and then it should come up and just ask me to enter the credentials for my SQL server. So this is basically asking me, well, where is your SQL server that contains your backed up database, where the database you restored from backup with a disaster recovery snapshot in it? And of course, I did not do anything with it. After I took my snapshot, I just left it there. So the database server name, by the way, is just SQL Server 1. And then I need to know what the database name is. So again, I'll go to my SQL Server, and the database I'm pointing to is this one here, the EPO Server 1. So that's the database name that I have to use. The name that pre-populates here is just based off the existing server you're installing to. So I'll change that, then I'll enter my SQL credentials. It's going to verify those credentials. It's going to make sure that it can connect to that machine using the username password that you've set, that you have a database with that name on it. And just while we're waiting for that to connect, I do want to quickly demonstrate how to check the snapshot table if you don't know, if you don't have access to EPO. So for example, if your EPO server already failed, the server already went down, you don't know if you have a snapshot, or you don't know if that's a recent snapshot. The snapshot itself is stored in a table named Orion Snapshot. So in the database, in the EPO primary database, you'll see a table named Orion Snapshot. So you can run a quick query, select star from Orion Snapshot within SQL against that database, and it's going to return all of the data from that table. Now, there's a lot of data here. We don't need to look at most of it. The main thing that we're looking at is the date here. So you'll have a date column, and that'll kind of tell you all of these rows should basically be the same date. Time will change just slightly because the snapshot generally takes several minutes to run. But here it says, August 30th. So this is a recent backup of my database. So that tells me, yes, I do have a current snapshot in there. So if I want to try to restore from that snapshot, I can, again, as long as I know the DR passphrase. So that, again, this is important. If you don't know that, you won't be able to restore from that. So back on my second server, the pre-installation auditor has run. It's come up with some warnings here. I can proceed with warnings. I can't proceed with error messages. I don't have any red X's here, so it should be fine. I know all these to be fine. This is just a simple lab environment. On a production server or a real QA server, you may actually have to go through and check the messages here that are on this. By the way, if you don't already know, you can click on each one of these warning messages here, and down at the bottom will give you a little bit more information about it, and then also a KB to check that will walk you through going through a full check of whatever warning this is to make sure you've taken care of that. But in my case, I know it's not going to; these aren't going to hinder me. So I'll go ahead and click finish on the pre-installation auditor, and it'll proceed to the next step, which just checks what comes up with the list of ports that EPO is going to be using. And so I'll click next on that. It's going to go through and verify that these ports aren't already in use. If there are any that are already in use, it's going to come up and ask you to change those. So after it verifies those, then it's going to ask me for what my admin password is, my DR passphrase. So I want to make sure that I know both of these. So the admin password, of course, is just going to be EPO console admin, right? And so this is just the default admin account. This is one that's set up when you install EPO. If you're using that, great. If you're using another admin account, that's also fine, just as long as it's an actual EPO admin account. Now I'm going to enter my DR passphrase. That's the one that I would have had to have changed or that had changed in the earlier demonstration. I know this to actually be the same password as I was using before, but again, that's where you have to make sure you have the correct password. It's not going to check the password. It's just to make sure that the password you entered matches what you re-entered there, but it's not going to verify that that password works, because at this point, I'm going to hit install, and the first thing it's going to do is it's going to lay down a set of initial files on the hard drive that allows the installer to go into the database and get that snapshot. And at that point, it's going to try to decrypt the snapshot before it lays all of that data down on the hard drive. And if it can't decrypt that snapshot using the passphrase you entered, then that's the wrong passphrase, and then the install will fail. And then you'll have to go back and try it again and enter a new password and see if it succeeds that time. But that's pretty much it for this presentation. That concludes the install. I'm not going to let this complete. This is actually going to take 20 minutes or so, so that's not really going to make a difference in a demonstration. I would say if you're going through this in real time, probably a couple of things that you want to check after this does complete. Of course, you want to make sure that you can get in the EPO console. You want to check your system tree to make sure your groups and systems are there. Your server tasks, your queries, all the other things that you configured in EPO should be there just as they were when that snapshot task was run. And then another thing you want to do just to be sure is go into your system tree and look at the last communication time of your client machines, sort by last communication time. So the most recent ones are at the top. At this point, you should have client machines that are communicating. If you have a very small environment, you may have to send a wake-up call to several machines to verify they come back. But if you have a couple thousand machines or more, you'll probably see that some machines are already communicating by that point. So it's a pretty good check. If you find it, after the disaster recovery completes, the agents aren't communicating, you want to find out now rather than later, just to make sure you can take care of that if you have to redo something or fix something or what have you. But as far as the presentation goes, that's pretty much it for me. So I'll go ahead and hand it back over to Nick.
Thanks, Chris. As a reminder for everyone, Trellix Education Services offers exceptional training to go along with our award-winning products. If you would like to learn more, please visit the website listed on your screen to see all of our offerings. Now let's get our Q&A session started. I see we have several questions, but it's not too late to add your question. Please type it in the Q&A window to submit. Additionally, take a moment to fill out the survey. Your feedback and suggestions are always appreciated. How many iterations of the snapshot are retained in the EPO database? Is it just the latest snapshot, or does it retain additional historic snapshots?
Yeah, so when you take a snapshot through EPO, it stores that into the database. Once you take another snapshot, it basically overwrites the one that's in the database already. So there's just one iteration essentially. So there's not a way to actually take multiple snapshots from different time periods. So just the one.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. How important is it that you stop the EPO services before performing the upgrades? The CU updates have this as part of the steps now, so is it really needed to stop those services?
That's more of a best practices. Actually, if EPO is not really doing anything in the back end, then you run the updater with the services running. It'll try to stop the services, and it could succeed and then proceed. However, we find that the application service or the EPO Tomcat service is actually often doing something in the background that when you try to stop the service, it's going to need to finish that task in the background before it stops. That could take it several minutes. And so in that case, the EPO updater may fail. You won't typically encounter an issue based off that. You just have to, go back, stop the services manually and try again. But it's always just best practice to stop all of those services beforehand, before running the updater.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that one. Can I do a snapshot in EPO 5.10 Update 4 installed on Windows Server 2012 and the DB installed on another Windows Server 2012 and restore the snapshot on the EPO installed on the Windows Server 2019 and the DB to be restored on another Windows Server 2019? Is that possible?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. You can, the main thing is you just, when you're restoring to a different server, whatever the OS running is, it just has to be one of the supported OSs, which 2019, of course, is.
When you're restoring the database into SQL, the SQL version that you're using has to be the same version or higher than what the SQL version that database came from.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that one. Can we do a test restore to a use and trash server just to be sure that the process is working? Will the database be linked to this new server, or would it continue to work with the original and still working EPO?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of people actually do a test restore. It's something that we would certainly recommend. Actually, do a test restore to just to start up a temporary VM if you'd like or whatever. In that situation, you probably are going to take a copy of your database and restore that as a maybe a different database name or to a different database server or database instance. So you're keeping that separate from your production server, right? So you don't want to restore to a test server and point to the database that your prod server is running. That's the main thing. But absolutely, you can restore to a temporary or test server just to make sure that it works. And then we would definitely encourage that.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that one. If I take a full VM snapshot of the EPO and database, do I still need to consider the manual and snapshot backup steps?
I would always say the more backups you have, the better. But absolutely, if that's your backup method, that's fine. We have a lot of customers that do that as well. So you have take a virtual machine snapshot instead of a EPODR snapshot. The main thing that you have to take into consideration there is that if your database and the EPO server are different machines, you definitely have to have a snapshot of both from the same time. Going back to the point made earlier in the presentation that your database and your snapshot, your database and your EPO install have to match.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that one as well. If we're running Service Pack 1 version 4067, what is the best method to get to the latest Service Pack version?
So I think in that case, so that would be, if I remember correctly, 4067 would be the original post of SP1. So in that case, I think you can run the reposted SP1 to get to that 4098 build, I believe.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that one. What checks does the cumulative update installer EPO updater.exe run against EPO before executing?
Yeah, so the cumulative updater, doesn't run like it's the PIA. So you maybe it's the pre-installation auditor that does actually go out and run several checks against the EPO server and the database to make sure that there's not something in there, the setting wise or free space wise, that we know will possibly cause the install to fail. So the EPO updater package doesn't actually have a check like that. It's going to do some basic checks. Is the OS supported in the can we connect to the database? Do the credentials work from the account you're using? Things like that. So very, very basic.
Just to
Got it.
add
Oh,
on
sorry.
to that, I'm just going to add to that, the later versions of CUs, they do have some compatibility checking. So they will check for incompatible extension versions, and they will flag those if they're found. But
Gotcha.
as Chris
Right.
says, they don't do the full pre-install check looking for things like drive space and so on. So there's limited compatibility checking, not as much as a full PIA.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you both. In the case of a disaster recovery happens and the new EPO server is set up in a new server, will the existing agents still be able to be managed?
Yes. So if you perform a disaster recovery using one of the methods that was mentioned, so like a manual disaster recovery from KB 66616 or the disaster recovery snapshot, clients will be able to communicate to the new server. If the server has actually got the same IP or name then the client should be able to find it. If not, then you can create a DNS alias to point machines over to that new server. But yeah, as long as the disaster recovery was done successfully using one of those two methods, then yeah, the existing clients can communicate to the new server.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that one. Do you have any information on when the next service pack will be released or the next cumulative update?
So yeah, we don't have another service pack planned as it stands. Cumulative update, as mentioned in the presentation, cumulative update 1 for SP1 is the latest update available now. And let me see real quick. We have date on CU2 is currently scheduled for end of October-ish, but don't quote me on that because it's, the date could always change on that. If we find that we'll go through QA testing and something has to be changed, but as it stands, into October should be released as CU2, cumulative update 2.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that one. Is there a different procedure for agent handlers versus the EPO server?
Guessing, so I'm not sure if the question is specific to cumulative updaters or DR, so I'll answer both. Cumulative updaters, you basically you do the same process, right? So, and actually, it's probably something I should have brought up in the presentation, so I apologize on that. So, if you install a cumulative updater to EPO server, you will take that same updater and then run it against any remote handlers that you have. For disaster recovery, on those, the agent handler itself, I mean, you don't have, there's nothing there to restore per se. There's no real configuration unless you have to point it to a different server. If you end up restoring EPO to a different server, worst case scenario, you just reinstall the handler and then it'll start connecting.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that one. You may have answered this one when we were talking about the EPO updater tool, but I just want to double check. Does the EPO updater EXE not look for unsupported extensions?
It does, yeah. That was the compatibility check that we mentioned a couple of steps back. So yeah, it's the same thing basically. It will check for unsupported extensions, but it won't check for disk space and so on, the kind of thing that the full PIA tool does. Extensions, yes. Everything else, no.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that one as well. What is the maximum time frame that is allowable between the server snapshot and the database snapshot?
Yeah, there's not really a time frame. The biggest thing that will cause a problem there is if there are any changes to the EPO installation. So, based on what I mentioned in the presentation, when you take a snapshot, it's going to take the files that are on the hard drive of the EPO server and store them in the database. So you'll have the most important thing there. You'll have extensions, and there's bits of that extension that get stored on the hard drive of the EPO server and the various tables in the database. So if you take a snapshot and then something changes on your EPO installation, then you back up the database, then you could have a mismatch. Otherwise, if nothing changes between the time that you take the backup, snapshot, and the time you take the backup, then it should match.
Got it. Okay.
So I would just to add to that. Sorry, it's always best practice to just to make sure nothing changes between the snapshot and the database. Back up your database as soon as you can after the snapshot.
Got it. Okay, perfect. That makes sense. Thank you for that one. We do have a question around, or maybe just a comment around someone, when they were doing a disaster recovery, their agent handlers failed to communicate with the DR server. I'd recommend if you're seeing any issues when you're doing a disaster recovery, to contact our support team, and they'll be able to help you troubleshoot any issues that you're seeing. Do you know how the future EPO updates will work, if the service pack number will change, or is it the update number that will change?
Yeah, I mean, as it stands right now, again, there's not really any plan to release another service pack. I mean, the main reason that we did that service pack 1 for EPO 510 is because we went from the McAfee branded software to the fully branded Trellix software, and so we removed the McAfee branded software from our website. And then including the full installation package. So this is essentially a way to release a full installation package for the fully Trellix branded software. So don't anticipate another service pack release in the future. I mean, we'll definitely have additional cumulative updates.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that one. So just to verify, we're currently running EPO 510 update 15. Can we update to service pack 1 with the full installer?
That is a no. You cannot. Yeah, you can't use the full installer unless you're installing new, or you're upgrading from an earlier version, say 5.9 to EPO 5.10. So it's a good question. It definitely gets a little bit confusing with the with the versioning that we've gone from and to. So there's this, as I mentioned, there's a Service Pack 1 full installer, and then there's a Service Pack 1 update. And so the update is what you want to use. If you're running some previous version of 5.10, you run Service Pack 1 update, not the full installer.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that one. You may have just touched on this, but just to clarify, why did the naming scheme change from Update 1 through Update 15 to Service Pack 1 and Service Pack 1 Update 1? Was that just the change from McAfee to Trellix software?
Yeah, right. And that was basically, again, we removed the previous full installer. And now, yeah, so we released another full installer. SP1 is that full installer. So it's that's that line in the sand there. So yeah, it's the same reason.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that one. I noticed during the disaster recovery demo on the new server, it only points to the existing DB instance. For the event instance, do we need to do anything extra with that piece?
Oh, so no, right. Yes, exactly. So when you're installing EPO and you're doing a DR like in the demo, you point to the primary EPO database. So the primary EPO database actually has what's called a synonym in there that points it, anything that's referencing events, that synonym points it to the events database. That's kind of, I think I mentioned in the presentation, it's important if you do a backup of the EPO database, backup both the primary and the events database. And if you restore that to a new SQL server, say, or a new instance or whatever, you're restoring both of those databases, and the primary database has that synonym that can point to the events database.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that one as well.
Yep.
All right, it looks like that's all the questions that we had for today's session. I want to thank everyone for joining today's webinar, and a big thank you to our speakers, Chris and Joe. As a reminder, a link to today's recorded presentation will be emailed to all registered attendees. This concludes today's webinar. Stay safe, everyone.